Good morning, everybody, or good evening, or good night, or good afternoon, depending on what time of the day you are listening. So, I know why we're all here. We're all here because this is the episode where we talk about Afro-Mexicans. Sounds cool. Sounds great. I got 3 centuries of history to go over. There will be a pause in the middle because I have to take my dogs outside. It's not an if, and, or but about it. I got to take them out. And I'll probably be gone for approximately 25 minutes. So I'll have my camera. I should be able to record outside. I'm getting stuff set up for tomorrow. I use Riverside. Except all cookies. I use Riverside. Okay, I'll send them a link to Riverside later. Okay, so I'll put my phone on the charger. So, like always, this may be a serious episode. This may be one of the most serious topics I've ever talked about. But we're going to start off the same way as always. Some interesting facts about Mexico. And these are pretty good ones today. So, Mexico has the most Spanish speakers in the world, with 113 million native speakers of the language. Mexico has the most Spanish speakers out of any country in the world, so make sure you remember to practice rolling those R's before you visit. Yeah, so Mexico, with the size that Mexico is, it has the most, just because it's huge. It's big. It's a big area. Spain's a smaller country. Other countries aren't as big, or they're too spread out. Mexico is densely populated, large area. Mexico City is the largest Spanish-speaking city in the world. The capital metropolitan area is home to over 21 million residents, which makes it around 50% larger than the next biggest Spanish-speaking city, Buenos Aires, roughly about 14 million. That's insanity. And the last 2 things, they drink more Coca-Cola than anyone else. So, if you go to Mexico, they drink about 2.2 liters per day of Coca-Cola. Yeah, some regions of the country chugging down 2.2 liters. Where I'm from, or my family's from in Mexico, that is true. That's all you see everywhere is Coca-Cola. You don't see anything else. Normally, I'd also be streaming this on the side on TikTok, but not today. Today is just focusing on these 2 things to get this recording. So, let's do this. Make sure you click on the link below, and that way you can follow me everywhere. It has all my links. Mexico brought chocolate to the West is the final one that we're going to talk about. Talking about fun facts about Mexico, you have to mention the food. And while we love dishes, the dishes you get in any country, especially Mexico, one of the most famous exports is now beloved all over the globe, chocolate. The addictive treat is associated with Oaxaca region, where they serve creamy hot chocolate almost everywhere. Chocolate is a vital component of many of the famous moles, often seen as the country's national dish. Mole, like the most delicious thing on the planet. But the way it's described, the most basic level of description is that it is peanut butter chocolate. Peanut butter chocolate sauce on chicken. That's about it. It sounds weird, but it is delicious. I'm glancing down here because that's where y'all are. And right here in front of me is going to be my main screen. So we can close out of this. I can minimize it. I don't need to close it out. And big. So let's officially get started. Welcome to Espooky Mysteries. This episode is called Afro Mexico, the forgotten chapter in Mexico's history. An episode that uncovers the hidden chapters of Mexico's complex history. Join me, Joe Rios, as I delve into the untold stories of the African despair in Mexico and the devastating impact of colonialism on the indigenous people of Mexico. From the transatlantic slave trade to the forced assimilation of native cultures, we'll explore the dark legacy of oppression and resistance that has shaped Mexico's identity. Through the voices of historians, activists, and descendants of those who lived through the painful history, we'll examine the ways in which the past continues to haunt us today. Get ready to confront the shadows of Mexico's past, and tune in every week for a new episode of Espooky Mysteries. So, this is where it begins. And I wrote like 6 to 7 pages. We will pause in between and we'll talk about it and we'll dissect some of this information. But this is a lot. Let's start off with the biggest question. Why were the slaves ever brought over? Several reasons why it was the cause of the several reasons why was because it was the I must have been on something because I can't read my own writing. Several reasons why it was the cause of the dramatic loss of the indigenous people. So several reasons why was because it was the dramatic loss of the indigenous people. I wrote that weird. Dramatic loss of the indigenous people. Historians believe that an estimated 27,650,000 indigenous people in Mexico in 1519. But by 1532, that number dropped below 16,800,000. That's approximately a 10,850,000 loss. That was just the beginning. 1580, another fall in the population occurred, resulting in only 1.9 million people left. It was not the end of the indigenous people. The original Mexican, the long line of warriors, the start of civilization. The last drop was in 1605, leaving 1,075,000 Native Americans, or indigenous Mexicans. However, historians do not believe this number to be true. Some believe that by 1519, less than 10 million were left. The only thing that historians do agree on is that disease and being overworked is the main cause of decimation in the population in the 16th century. Cause of the decline was largely due to the native population being isolated, meaning that disease wreaked havoc when the Spaniards arrived. The isolation of being cut off from the rest of the world stopped from being affected by a wide range of diseases like smallpox that ravaged the country in 1520. So, because of where it was at and how small of an area it was, we were cut off from the rest of the world. We were just little Mexico. We were just there doing our thing. And the rest of the world was being, explored. Because you have the Spaniards, the Armadas, the English, all the Americans, 13 colonies, things like that. Everything was going on. People were exploring. But the indigenous people were not. They were just there. They were in their area because the way they traveled could have just been up and down, and that was enough. Not enough, but that was everything they could do. They didn't need to travel. Other places were smaller locations. They decided to move around. That's what happens. That's exploration. Our exploration was up and down. Other smaller countries, their exploration was east to west. Immunity from such diseases was non-existent. During the first century of the conquest of Mexico, they suffered 19 major epidemics. The most serious occurred in, this is all of them that I can find, 1520, 1548, 1576 through 1879, and in 1595 through 1596. I know some of those are wildly like in between each other, but it's multiple times, right? It was a plethora of diseases that affected the population, including smallpox, chickenpox, diphtheria, influenza, scarlet fever, measles, typhoid, mumps, and colonialism, a hemorrhagic disease. It made the invasion easier, but it also affected the labor causes, a shortage where the solution was the introduction of African slaves. So all of this loss caused the Spaniards and everyone to realize that without this indigenous population, there's nothing we can do. We are either going to have to bring in our own people to build, and if we bring in our own people, we're going to have to pay them because they're going to come over. They got to do all this, and we got to pay them here, house them, and everything, right? What's the easiest way? Free labor. How do they get free labor? Slaves. The Spanish introduced a system to regulate the labor force, the Encomienda system. This essentially is a grant or parcel, meaning that those who were chosen by the Spanish royalty received a tribute and labor allotment from the royal tributaries. In return, the grantee undertook care for the property and spiritual well-being of those in his charge. So in other words, if you were chosen by the king or royalty of Spain, they gave you people. And it was your job to take care of them, teach them religion, and feed them and house them and all that stuff. But it's free labor. So what do you think people are going to do? They're not going to take care of people very well. They're going to abuse the system, and it's going to wreak havoc. The system was prone to abuse and corruption of the charges. This heightened the labor need as the Indians suffered, and those that remained were whipped, imprisoned, tortured, raped, and killed, resulting in population loss. The Indians were exempted from taxes and tithings, but had to pay head tax every year. So we still haven't got to Spain introducing slaves. They're still with the Native Americans. They're trying to make do with what they got, which is why they're splitting up all the costs and everything amongst themselves. But they're like, look, you're going to work for us. We're going to take care of you. We're going to house you. You don't have to pay taxes. You don't have to give to the church. They try to spin it into a good narrative. They didn't have to pay major taxes, but they still had a form of tax to pay, but had to pay head tax every year. Men and women were forced to work in the mines and obrejas, the textile shops, to toil away for long hours. There was one sort of good person. He wasn't really. He was kind of good, but not really good because of what he did. So you're going to understand what I mean by that. Whether he was sort of a good person, but not really. Bishop Bartholomew de las Casas was sickened by the plight of the Aboriginals in the West Indies and an apostle to the Indians in the Spanish New World as it was known. He campaigned against using the people of the New World for the more durable Africans. Like I said, a good guy, but not really. So he was like, we're treating the natives here so bad, sickening. It makes me worried for their well-being. You know what the solution is? Slaves, the Africans. That's a better, yay, you helped the indigenous. You brought in slaves. Like, how? How can one be justified? If you're going to push towards the health and the plight of people, you cannot bring in other people as a substitute to continue on that plight. It's a catch-22. It doesn't make sense. That's why I said he's not really a good guy. Natives thought he was great because he freed them, but then he's bringing in all these slaves. It's not right. Casas proposed to King Charles V of Spain for this to happen. The king agreed to this. To this, the use of slavery was approved. The use of 4,000 slaves a year to Hispaniola, Cuba, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico thus marked the beginning of Spain's hand in the slave trade, with the first shipment of 4,000 slaves arriving in Hispaniola in 1517 and redistributed to Cuba and Puerto Rico. Millions more would pass through this system to the Spanish colonies, the Caribbean islands, and to North America. For the next 4 centuries, this would fuel the Western economics and turn the Africans or the Africas into a spent resource. You know what's a spent resource? Our oil supplies. You know what's a spent resource? Gas. That's a spent resource. That's something that we use so much that we are running out of. People should never be spent resource. So again, this is a serious subject. We're going to get through this. We're going to talk about everything, and I'm going to explain as much as I can in the greatest detail as I can. We have to remember, the indigenous people did not bring slaves. The original Mexicans did not have a hand in this. It was the colonizers. It was Spain. It just gets me so worked up. And it's not Spaniards are bad. It was during this time frame, Spaniards brought them in. And we'll get through this. We'll talk about this later, right? It's believed that at minimum, 100 small ethnic groups from the Africas may have disappeared as a result of this system. As the native population of Mexico declined, the economy of the colonies became more complex. With the introduction of the silver mines being opened in 1534 and the cultivation of sugarcane to take root in Mexico around the same time alongside of the already existing textile workshops, ranches, and haciendas meant that a workforce was needed. So with Spain and Mexico ever growing, because now the indigenous people are not being used. So they're just living life alongside. They're being assimilated by the Spanish. And now they have the haciendas and they're managing the textile plants. They probably own the textile plant, works for the textile plants. They're working in the mines, los ranchos, all that stuff, right? Who are they going to use for their workforce? Something that is easier to use. Now, the Indians, the natives, the indigenous of Mexico are going to more likely use their own people, which is going to cause a divide. It's going to cause a divide. But the Spanish that own everything, like all the land and all the territories and the workshops and the ranches and the haciendas and the mines, everything that they own, who are they going to use because it's going to help them the most and make the most profit? They're going to use the slaves. They looked to free labor, which meant more profit since no one had to be paid. The Spanish authorities convinced themselves that this was the only way to go. In 1542, King Charles V brought the new laws of the Indies, basically abolishing Indian slavery in Mexico. So now the indigenous are free. This gave incentive to Spanish businessmen to bring slaves to the American shores. Africans performed the most arduous tasks on plantations. Spaniards believed that Africans were the superior workforce. It is thought that one African equaled 4 indigenous. So one person is going to take the job of 4 people. That is what they believe. That is, I don't know why, but that is what they believe. And that could also be why Hispanics, especially Mexicans, are headstrong. And like the best example I can put this in is in boxing. Whatever a Mexican boxer faces off against an African American, an African, whatever boxer, an African ethnic background boxer, they fight so vigorously. They are 2 of the most stubborn boxers I have ever seen in my life. And they will keep going until someone is forced to stop. And I think this was it because the indigenous were like, what do you mean one of them is 4 of us? It could be just genetic disposition of, it's a trait that was put into us because of this. I'm looking too far into it, but I'm just drawing lines, From 1521 to 1639, that's 118 years, 110,525 slaves were legally shipped into Mexico. The early decades, the trade, many more were first brought from Guinea-Bissau and seen in Gambia. Guinea and Bissau and seen in Gambia. They were believed to be more docile and more trustworthy, so they were treated better. Tell me, this is where class divide comes in. By the 17th century, the majority of slaves were brought from Angola and the Congo. With the lack of female slaves, most of the men eventually chose to marry Indian and mestizo women as their spouses. The Siete Partidas law of Spain granted the men the right to marry as they pleased. So, one freedom they did have was they could marry whoever they wanted. Masters were not allowed to intervene. This, along with the petition of the Catholic Church, made way for children of slaves to gain their freedom, were allowed to live with their mothers. Since it was banned to use indigenous slaves, so it gave more reason for slaves to marry outside partners. So, since it's, banned to use indigenous people as slaves, the smart thing to do was for the African slaves to marry indigenous women and have their kids be free. That's all I can say is that it gave an opportunity for the children of slaves to be free. They weren't forced into that life. They were at least allowed to leave. Granted, they never saw their dad again, the father figures, because they were allowed to leave with the mother. I'm pretty sure there was situations where they lived together, blah, 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 right? But a lot of times, I'm going to take a wild guess and say, like, I wouldn't want my child to see me as that in that situation. I'd be like, look, you're free. You're my wife. I'm going to need you to go somewhere else. You know what I mean? That's just me. Using the Spanish classing system, using race, the Catholic Church recorded most of the colonial Mexico time frame. From the 1600s through the 1700s in places like San Luis Potosí, Zacatecas, Aguascalientes, and Guanajuato, records from the Catholic Church show that the marriage of male slaves to mestiza, Indians, and mulatas, I can't speak sometimes. I know some of that last one's a little bit offensive. It's likely that these children were free individuals, as opposed to the records of the United States that are almost impossible to locate. They just were not recorded by either the church, plantation, or government. While in Mexico, the church documented countless marriages of the unions between the Spanish, mestizos, and the Indian people. The economic influence of the Africans in Mexico can be felt in various cities throughout. In various cities. So, slavery in America, nothing was documented because they were just considered things. In Mexico, a little bit different because they were people. They were governed more by the Catholic Church than anything else. And the Catholic Church is very strict about keeping records, especially of weddings, baptismals, and things like that. They kept pristine records of all that stuff. So I guarantee you they kept a record of it. With the decline of the Indian population of Mexico, someone had to fill the labor shortage, and the newly freed children had an opportunity to prosper. This can be seen in Zacatecas, which by the 1830s had the following numbers: 11,000 Spaniards and mestizos, 9,500 Indians, and 12,500 African and mulattoes. These numbers are a testament as to the impact of Africans had in their services through labor to the Mexican colonial economy. With the Spaniards and the Europeans living in Mexico, had the privilege of enjoying the highest, that prestige, and the most extensive of economic privileges. Those classified as Indians, mestizos, and mulattoes were on the opposite end of the spectrum, of the social spectrum. So, those at the top are going to be Spaniards, Europeans, colonizers. Middle class, Indians, mestizos, mulattoes. So Indians, native Mexicans, and mixed race. Those at the bottom are going to be Afro-Mexicans, which is direct lineage of African and my brain just had a brain fart. Direct lineage of the African's descent. So, the first generation, essentially, or persons of mixed race blood were seen as the lowest in society because they were of African descent. So, closer to African descent you were, the lower you were. Considered socially inferior to Indians and mestizos, Afro-Mexicans were subject to taxist laws. Racist laws is probably the word I was looking for. I put a T instead of an R. Yeah, they're right together. Racist laws created to separate them from the indigenous financially and socially. With penalties involved, soon the wars of liberation started. In the first 3 decades of the 19th century brought an end to the Spanish slavery of Africans in Mexico. So, the first 3 decades of the 19th century. So we went from the 1800s to the 1900s. In the first 30 years, they stopped it. Well, we'll get into that thoroughly, but they started the process of putting an end to this injustice. It is estimated that the total number of African-born slaves brought to Mexico till the end of the institution was abolished in 1827. So from the beginning that they were introduced all the way to when it was stopped, or when they were supposed to stop, when it was abolished in 1827, was thought to be about 200,000. This number of 200,000 sounds like a large portion of the population compared to Mexico's overall population through the colonial period. It's quite small. Statistics indicate that at any given time, the African and Black population never reached above 2%. Since the 1820s, most of the African culture had been assimilated into the general population. In some parts of eastern Mexico, the presence of African culture can be seen. So it is prevalent in some parts, but by then it was all brought in. It was all, like I said, it was assimilated. In other words, it was all equal. Everyone just chilled, just hung out. It wasn't the best of times, but that's how life happens. In some parts of eastern Mexico, the presence of African culture can be seen. Yet in other Latin American countries, the images of the nation incorporate a third root, African descendants. African influences are seen and felt in Brazil, from candomblé to capoeira. Different things. Capoeira is like dance fighting. In Cuba through Santeria and Salsa, and in Peruvian music and their Pacific Coast communities. The African presence extends through Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, Venezuela, and throughout Latin America. Despite the dominant narrative, African descendants also have a history and presence in Mexico. So no matter what, they have a strong presence in Mexico. It is seen in our bloodline. It is seen in our people. I mean, it's a part of us. Whether we know it or not, there is Africans in all of us, especially Mexicans, because we were colonized. So I could tell you right now, my genetics, I don't know it 100% because I haven't done it. My mom has, I have not. So I know there's African, right? But just because this super patchy beard, that's an indigenous American trait. That is an indigenous Mexican trait because they just weren't able to grow. This crappy beard was because of that. And like I said, there is through genetic testing that my mom had done, there is African, there is Spaniard, there is all these things that make us who we are. So Mexicans did not have slaves. They were brought in and introduced, and we accepted them. But through the Spanish class system, we had to assimilate and we had to know our place. We were in the middle, and unfortunately, they were at the bottom. And I hate to say it, that's most likely how they were treated. But since we were both lower than the Spaniards and the Europeans, I'm taking a wild guess and be like, we were more alike than anything else, which is why a lot of Mexicans and Africans and a lot of people we get along very well, except for Mexicans and Mexicans. I don't know why. Mexicans and any other race, just like Mexicans and Peruvians and Salvadorians and Cubans and whatever, for some reason it's just a love-hate relationship. But Mexicans and Africans, African Americans, it's a different story. We're like, for some reason we relate a lot more. And this could be why, because we were both colonized. We were both forced into something that we didn't want to do. Just one lasted longer than the other. But as Mexicans, we did not, I repeat, we did not have a hand in it. It was forced upon us. And until we were able to separate and become ourselves again, did we stop it. Because we knew it wasn't right. So by the time Mexico became Mexico and we were doing our thing, we were like, no, we're done. We're abolishing slavery. So I know I keep getting off on these tangents, but this is something that we have to talk about. This is a conversation that does need to happen. In 2015, the Mexican government conducted an interim census that incorporated African descendants into the categories of race and ethnicity, which had not been done since 1830s. Citizens had the opportunity to self-identify, and almost 2 million people identified as African descent. After the results of the 2015 census were released, media outlets immediately questioned where African descents in the interim census came from, some speculating they were recent immigrants from West Africa or from the Caribbean. So, this dark history of Mexico, the stuff that we went through, all the way to 2015, the stuff that we went through, the stuff that the Africans went through, was largely forgotten because everyone was just Mexican because they were living in this country. There was no more divide of you're an African Mexican, you're a mestizo Mexican, you're a mestizo African, you're indigenous. It was not separate anymore. It was one entity, which is why everyone was like, why are you identifying as that? Is it because there's people coming in now? Is this where it's coming from? No, it wasn't because of recent immigration. It was because of our history and our backgrounds. And a lot of people were now starting to investigate who they really were, what made them who they are. And this is where that came from. But the history of Mexico's slave trading in the 16th century. So that's the end of that sentence. Yeah. So some speculating that they were recent immigrants from West Africa or from the Caribbean. But the history of Mexico's slaves from trading in the 16th century. Sorry, to my son, it's bedtime. We'll cut that here. So to recap, Mexico having a population of around 200,000 principally West African slaves that outnumbered the Spanish colonialists for decades and was for some time the largest in the Americas. Black slaves were typically used by the Spanish to act as foremen, overseeing the indigenous populations, and many of the mostly male slave population went on to marry indigenous women. Therefore, and due to the many resulting mixed race offspring, Black Mexicans were all but forgotten about for centuries as their bloodlines mixed with other indigenous communities and mestizo people of Mexico. So, like I said, throughout the time, we just became one people. It was never it stopped being about different people. It was just one people. Which honestly, I wish we should get back to that one unity. Our country is so divided right now. And, Mexico may have all its problems, but it's one people. They're not against each other. They're against evil and corruption. So they're against the cartels and gangs. They're against the corrupted government, but they're not against each other. Not like here, though, where it's like, you like that president? Oh, well, you like that person? That's petty rivalry. We don't need that. What is that all about? We need an evil. That's what we should be against. The gangs, the wars, everything like that. Not against each other for no reason. Like I said, Mexico may have its problems, but their people are more united than any other place. I can't say that. I'm pretty sure there's places out there that are very united, but like more united than America, than the USA. I'm probably going to get wiretapped after this by the CIA or something when I post this episode. In the 1500s and early 1600s, New Spain, colonial Mexico, had one of the highest importation rates of enslaved Africans to the Americas, leading to large populations in cities in their first decade of independence. The Mexican government abolished the slave trade in 1824 and the institution of slavery in So, the 1500s to the 1600s, Spain were bringing them in. We outnumbered everywhere, right? Or not we, but Spaniards outnumbered us in the slave trade. There were so many that it was more of them than there were of them. There were more Africans than there were of the Spaniards. They were just bringing in people, and that was the slave trade. Bringing them in. Okay, you're going here, you're going there, whatever, right? But when Mexico gained their independence in the first decade, the Mexican government abolished the slave trade. They abolished it 24, 5, 26, 27, 28, 29. 5 years later, the institution of slavery. So they abolished the trade and then they got rid of slavery. They're like, we're done. We're out of that game. It has nothing to do with Mexico as a people. As a result of this, African Americans went south to take advantage of the new law. So, as a result of Mexico becoming Mexico and saying, we're not part of the slave trade no more, we're not a part of slavery anymore, that is not us. In the Americas, that was still a thing. So, where were they going? They were coming south to Mexico. And that created a problem. As a result of this, African Americans went south to take advantage of the new law. For example, on July 7th, 1839, 27 passengers boarded a merchant ship in New Orleans. They exited the ship in the Mexican port city of Tampico. Among the passengers were 7 African Americans whose passport status in Mexico listed them as enslaved. So, in July 7th, 1839, 27 people got on a ship in New Orleans and they got off in Tampico, Mexico. And 7 of those 27 people were slaves. Listen, these African Americans had traversed the Gulf, hidden on a merchant ship that took them from enslavement in the U.S. to newfound freedom in Mexico. So they got off. So they snuck aboard, stowaways. And they got off the Mexican ship and their information was noted. So they're like, okay, passport, oh, you're a slave. Welcome to Mexico. That was it. And they got away because it didn't exist in Mexico. We got rid of it. They're like, cool. Go down to like Julia's down there. She'll set you up with some food. Talk to Paco over there. He might get you a job. Welcome to the country. That's what they were doing. We weren't like, go back. No, we were like, cool, we got shit to do. We got things that need to get done. We'll help you find a place to live. Paquita over there makes some killer pozole, menudo. The bartender over there, he knows me. He'll give me some cervezas. We'll go have a beer after work. That they weren't tripping about it. They were like, hey, y'all made it here. Congratulations, man. You risked a lot, but you're free. Here, do whatever you want. And not do whatever you want, but you know what I mean. I don't know where that came from, but it's just one of those things that it fires me up. There you go. Hidden on the merchant ship that took them from enslavement in the U.S. to newfound freedom in Mexico. They practiced their own agency and took advantage of the abolition of slavery in Mexico. Passport records of New Orleans from 1830 to 1840, combined with Mexican importation logs, reveal a significant number of enslaved and free African Americans, who moved to Mexico. One of the most detailed works about slavery in Mexico is noted historian Colin A. Palmer's Slaves of the White God, Blacks in Mexico, 1570 through 1650. In the 1820s, Mexico began to restrict slavery, and on September 15, 1829, Presidente Vicente Guerrero issued the Guerrero Decree, which prohibited slavery in most of Mexico. Guerrero may have been of African ancestry. Even during the Spanish period, enslaved people had some legal protections, such as the ability to purchase their freedom or take legal action if they were abused. We got a notification. If they were abused. In the 1800s, enslaved people from Texas and Louisiana often fled to Mexico following trails left by Mexican traders or being helped by Mexican cartels. So the bandidos, they were helping them get over, Nowadays, they help us get over here, but back then they were helping them get over there. Mexican officials also refused to return runaways under the U.S. Fugitive Slave Act. So even though in the U.S. they were like, hey, if you run away, you get caught, you're going back. I don't know why I'm doing like a racist redneck accent. You going back, boy. But in Mexico, they're like, nah, give it that key. Stay here. Do whatever, man. Fuck them gringos. I'm sorry. That's going on TikTok. I marked it. The census of 2015 had a question that read, De acuerdo con su cultura, historia y tradiciones, se considera negra, es decir, afro-mexicana, afro-descendiente, which was asking each resident that if, according to their culture, history, and traditions, that they consider themselves to be Black, according to the census. There are 119,530,753 people that consider themselves of African descent and represented 1.2% of the total population of the country. Those are numbers from the 2015 census, and that's what it asked you. It was asking, like, do you consider yourself or any part of your culture, history, traditions, is any of that African? So that means that even though everyone became one people, traditions were still passed down from family to family that other people probably didn't practice, which is why that's culture or traditions or history, because it was asking, do you do stuff that may consider yourself historically as an African from or origins of Mexico, African Mexican? And yeah, that's how it was. That's how it is. Of almost 1.4 million, the largest number, 304,274, resided in the state of Mexico. In southern states like Guerrero and Oaxaca had the largest percentages at 6.5% and 4.9%. Mexico's 2020 basic census questionnaire asked all Mexicans, I'm going to have to read this in Spanish, por sus antepasados y de acuerdo con sus costumbres y tradiciones, blank, your name, se considera afro-mexicana or afro-mexicano, check here, negro, check here, afro-descendientes, where it says check here, that's like where you can check mark it, whatever you were. So, translate for those that don't speak Spanish. Because of your ancestors and according to your customs and traditions, does blank consider yourself Afro-Mexican, Black, or Afro-descendant? Mexico's Afro-Mexican population amounts to almost 2.6 million Mexicans, representing 2% of Mexico's overall population. Together, Guerrero and Oaxaca have 13.3% of the Afro-Mexican populations in the entire country. However, a total of 9 Mexican states have Afro-Mexican populations that exceed 2%, and those 9 states account for 31.2% of the Afro-Mexican citizens living throughout the country. Only 4 states have populations of Afro-Mexicans that exceed 3%. However, 1,336,686 Afro-Mexicans live in the 6 states of Jalisco, Mexico City, Veracruz, Oaxaca, the Mexico State, and Jalisco. With the largest number of Afro-Mexicans, this accounts for 52% of all the Mexicans in the country, who self-identified as being Afro-descendants. In fact, Mexico City, which became a state in 2016, has the second largest population, but has a lower percentage of Afro-Mexicans because of its very large population. Anyone who has seen the census statistics from the 16th and 17th century for various parts of Mexico know that the population of Negro esclavos and mulattoes quite often accounted for a third of the population. It is very likely that the blood of many of the Africans living in colonial Mexico has been submerged into and integrated within the identities of both indigenous and mestizo mezclada populations over the last few centuries. Our dogs, it's about time for them to go outside. We're going to finish this up. Over the last few centuries, in fact, it is also very likely that the number of Mexicans who had some African ancestors is much greater than the current population of Afro-Mexicans. But some of them may not be aware of it. Like I said, I didn't know until my mom did a DNA test. I'm eventually going to do one because I'm interested to see the numbers myself. Notable Afro-Mexicans are Gaspar Yanga, Vicente Guerrero. Gaspar was an important Mexican leader as a freedom fighter. Almost lost to time until recent times. His origins are unclear. He's like a hero. I mean, he's a freedom fighter, so he was a hero. Rumored to have been prince from what is now known as Gabon or Gabon. enslaved on a plantation somewhere around the city of Veracruz. He led an uprising in 1570. In the 1570s, Yanga gathered his followers and all the chaos that followed and escaped, forming their own community with Yanga as the leader. He became a thorn in the side of the Spanish authorities. After many failed attempts to destroy the community, the viceroy of New Spain thought it was time to negotiate with Gaspar Yanga with hopes of getting control again. With a priest as an intermediary, Alonso de Benavides, Yanga, not one to turn away from a challenge, demanded that the authorities recognize his community as a free one. As part of the truce, he would act as a slave catcher and return anyone who hadn't escaped before that year to the Spanish. So he wanted to be free. He wanted his people to be free. So he struck a deal. He struck a bargain. That wasn't to last, though. In 1609, any truce that was had was broken, and raids resumed on both sides. Just 1 year later, in the late 1610s, Yanga's community finally reached a deal with Spain, with the Spanish. So even though they were supposed to do something, they probably didn't. They probably still kept messing with each other, and they broke down, and it was like, nah, this ain't gonna work. But eventually they did come with a plan. Tensions remained, but the community known as San Lorenzo de los Negros to the Spanish, but in 1932 the town was renamed Yanga in honor of the great black Mexican liberator, San Lorenzo de los Negros. San Lorenzo for the blacks. That's the Spanish. That's the Spaniards. That's a racist name. Like, it's like today if you were to live in like Arlington of the Mexicans, Dallas of the whites. No, that'd be Richland Hills. But that's a thing. That's not right. I may be laughing, I may be breaking the tension a little bit, but that's still a lot of this is a serious subject. And finally, Vicente Guerrero, the first black president of Mexico. One of the greatest leaders of the Mexican War of Independence, is a source of pride, not just to black Mexicans, but to all Mexicans, regardless of racial background. Struggle, triumph, and betrayal are what make up his story. Like I said, we're one people. It's not African Mexicans or whatever. It's Mexicans. We're all one. That's why there was something that I read not too long ago, that no matter where you at in the world, there is Mexican. Whether you're born there or not, all you need is to have a little bit of Mexican in your blood, and you're a Mexican. That's it. We accept you as you are. It was someone for the Olympics. They weren't allowed to play for their country. They had Mexican heritage, so they played for Mexico, and they won. They won gold. Can't remember who it was, what event, but I read that. So like I said, no matter where you're at, there's always a Mexican. You just gotta look. Born in 1782 to African and indigenous Mesoamerican ancestry. By this time in history, Spanish rule was tenuous, with many Mexican-born ethnic Spaniards wanting independence. Joining the rebellion against Spain in 1810, 5 years later, he emerged one of the most influential leaders on the rebel side. He was an ally key to the success of Jose Maria Morelos. He makes a big show. He's like, I'm tired. I said, go to bed. And he's okay, and he takes off running. Kids, man. Success of Jose Maria Morelos, the insurgent priest alongside with another hero of Mexico, ultimately succeeding in the Mexican War of Independence. After 1821, the Spanish left. After having a short-lived emperor reign, Mexico became a republic. In 1829, he became Mexico's second president. After battles, both military and political, against his conservative opponents, General Anastasio Bustamante resented that a multiracial man was to lead Mexico. Fearing his liberal politics would pose a threat to the new country, his claim to fame was to abolish slavery. Even though the Spanish had ended the trade years earlier, Guerrero's decree brought the ultimate end to Mexican slavery. This brought conflict with slave-owning American settlers in Texas. War would break out in 1845 between Mexico and the USA over control of Texas. 3 months after the decree happened, a coup toppled him from power, retreating to the south with his followers. Someone he had met betrayed him to the authorities, and he faced a firing squad in 1831. And that is Mexico's history with slavery. That was a lot. That's a lot of information. This is a very serious subject. So what I want is go to my Instagram, go to my TikTok, go to my Facebook, go here on Spotify, wherever you can leave a comment. And leave a comment. Let me know what your opinion is. Let me know what your thoughts. And what started all this was because I saw a TikTok that was blaming Mexico for slavery. I was like, no, I'm actually gonna find it for y'all. Because that is something that just for some reason really just struck a nerve with me, and it started all this. It got me going, and I turned that down real quick. I got 14 messages. People like my videos. Nice. I've been getting a lot of likes recently. It's wild. I never thought that I would receive this much attention, even though this is what I've been working for. It's to grow my community, grow everything. That's why I have a Discord. That's why I have an Instagram. That's why I have a Facebook. That's why I have TikTok and all that stuff, so we can communicate with each other. I try to keep it as lighthearted as possible. I tried to do interesting subjects. That's why I'm Espooky Mysteries. I want to do stuff over the paranormal, true crime, and history of Latin America. And this person just really rubbed me the wrong way and created this. Okay. This is from their page.
And Mexican people, y'all can bring y'all ass here. Yay, slick, it's your turn. Did y'all know that Mexicans owned enslaved Africans for some 300 years? And in fact, they helped build up over 65% of what we know Mexico to be today. They helped build up their entire economy.
You hear that? We had nothing to do with that. It was forced upon us. And that's what triggered all this. And the video I saw was actually this one. He is the masked Mexican historian. It's his video that inspired me, because he was telling what he knows about Mexico's struggles with slavery. And I was like, this is a story, this is a history, this is a tale that needs to be told. And I did everything in my power, and I did as much research as I could bear to do. And I typed out all of this. The only thing I didn't type out, I'm going to tell you right now, was the introduction, because I was tired from typing. So I typed in the basics of the information and everything I was going to go over into ChatGPT. No, not ChatGPT. Into Meta AI, and created the intro. The intro y'all heard at the very beginning. But after the introduction, after, follow me on Espooky Mysteries, after all that was everything that I could find and I wrote about over this subject. That's everything for today, guys. I will see y'all next week. And the next week's episode after this is gonna be over Salvadorian folklore with the My Primos podcast. They're gonna be on. You can catch the stream. If you're watching right now, you can catch the stream tomorrow, 12:30 to whatever. I'm gonna be interviewing them on here, Twitch and YouTube. And I'm going to post it to Spotify once I edit it all out. We're going to talk about Salvadorian history, Salvadorian folklore. I think the Siguanaba is the main one he wants to talk about. So I'm going to bring up a couple other ones. I've done as much research as I can, and we're going to talk about it. We're going to flesh it all out. And that's it, everybody. Thank you for coming to Espooky Mysteries. And like always, stay spooky.